So good evening everyone. My name is Ina Pisipagan and tonight I will be presenting LGBTQI movements and issues in developmental discourse. So what is LGBTQI? LGBTQI is an initials that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex. So, LGBTQI is an organization as well as an increasing number of major societal institutions have embraced a gay identity paradigm for sexual orientation. So, the foundations of this paradigm are these beliefs. Number one is innate personal characteristics. So, when you grow up, there are members in your family who are the opposite sex or maybe having different personality is in your race, even if you were born straight. So, number two, people are born either gay, lesbian, or bisexual. They are not born gay or lesbian, but as they grow up, it is up to them how to carry their personality. Next is homosexual people become heterosexual. So like for example sa lalaki, kahit bakla sila ay may ano pa rin sila, 'di ba? May laki pa rin sila kahit bakla sila. Lalaki pa rin sila, pero nasa sa kanila na 'yun kung paano nila dadalhin yung personality nila. So number 4, there is no difference between being homosexual and being straight. Number There is no difference between not being straight and being straight, but the way homosexual people behave is different from being straight. And last is, there is no harm in being homosexual. In fact, may ibang organisasyon ng LGBTQI ang mas nakakatulong pa sa ibang tao. So, by these views, LGBTQI organizations claim and others have learned to accept that having the belief heterosexuality is preferable to homosexuality. So, history of LGBTQI visibility in the Philippines. The month of June is a watershed moment for the LGBTQI plus community all around the world. It was in June 1969 when the Stonewall riot in Manhattan, New York, changed the course of the gay liberation movement in the United States. That is why the world celebrates LGBT Pride in June. The Babaylan was the first record of women having significant roles in Philippine society. The Babaylans are primarily female spiritual leaders, priests, or shamans, but the role can also be filled by males who have homosexuals and have been referred to as asog. They were gender crossers as they were given the same spiritual position as the female babaylan. After the Second World War, the gay rights activist Justo established the Home of the Golden Gays in 1975. Originally intended to serve as a home for elderly gay men who have been kicked out by their families, mostly due to their lack of financial contribution. So itong Home of the Golden Gays in 1975 ay itinatag ng isang gay rights activist na si Justo. Ito ay para sa mga matatandang bakla na pinalayas ng kanilang pamilya dahil kulang sila sa pinansyal para sa kanilang pang-araw-araw. Pero sa kasamaang palad naman noong namatay si Justo, noong 2012 ay ipinasara na ito. The women's movement in the 1980s was a highlight the struggle of the lesbian community to be visible in the public. So, noong 1980s, ang kilusan ng mga kababaihan ay minarkahan nila ang isang pagbabago sa paglaban ng grupong lesbian for the public visibility. The underground women's organization Makibaka released a position paper including sexual orientation issues in the movement. So as a result, lesbian wanted their voices be heard in a struggle against by the government. Makibaka, an underground women's group, um, eventually issued a statement. Um, there is a position paper that includes sexual orientation problems. So, later in the 1990s, the issue of gender and sexuality became a major concern in the women's movement, leading to the formation of the lesbian collective, Lesbon. The media advocacy group can't live in the closet, and the first National Lesbian Rights Conference. One of the more memorable moments in the history of LGBTQI movement in the Philippines was the first LGBT Pride March on June 26, 1994 to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Stonewall Riot. So, the march was not only the first LGBTQI Pride parade in the Philippines but also in Asia. The parade had a limited turnout with only 60 people who participated. This event was organized by the Progressive Organization of Gays in the Philippines, or Pro-Gay Philippines, and the Metropolitan Community Church, or MCC, Manila. They marched from EDSA at Quezon Avenue to Quezon Memorial Circle in Quezon City. Ito ang first time sa publiko na nakakita sila ng LGBTQ people voice out on such a large scale for fairness. In October 2011, the Philippine Psychological Association, or PAP, released the LGBTQI Non-Discrimination Policy Resolution. This was in answer to a flood of letters, voice calls, and ethics complaints directed at a licensed psychologist who suggested conversion treatment for gay and lesbian youngsters in order to promote a normal family life. This position paper supported LGBTQI people's essential dignity and worth, as well as their right to be treated equally regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identification, or behavior. This resolution also reinforced the same position in 1973, viewing same-gender sexual orientation as healthy, non-disordered variant of human sexuality, love, and relationships. Noong November of 2014, the resolution was translated into Tagalog. So, despite legislation and rules, everyday LGBTQI+ individuals play a critical role in advancing this goal, fairness, by remaining visible and combating stigma. On June 30, 2016, the first transgender representative in the Congress, Geraldine B. Roman, submitted House Bill 267, otherwise known as the Anti-SOGI or anumang pronunciation discrimination act, and is currently up for approval. So some Philippine laws are used to blackmail LGBTQI people, while others outright prohibit gender expression and overlook gender identification in the workplace. So this is the Sustainable Development Goals and LGBTQ inclusion. Goal number 1 is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Discrimination can lead to poverty. So, hindi naman sa lahat ng bakla ay nadi-discriminate. Pero may mga tao talagang part ng LGBTQ na palaging nadi-discriminate. Kaya minsan nahihiya na sila magtrabaho, hindi pwede sa kanila yung trabaho, lagi silang nire-reject ng mga ina-applyan nila. Kaya doon nagsisimula yung paghihirap ng mga LGBTQ member. Yun. Exclusion and discrimination make it harder for LGBT people to earn money, stay secure, and pursue their goals. So, yun na nga yung ibig kong sabihin is, hindi nila matutupad yung mga goals nila kung um, wala silang trabaho or wala silang aksyon kung paano nila makamit yung goals nila. Wala silang perang ibibili ng mga gusto nila, yung mga gano'n, dahil sa dinidiscriminate sila ng mga tao. Many LGBT people are also rejected from the family support that most of us rely on. Talagang may mga pamilya na mga pamilyang hindi nila gusto na may membro sila ng or mga anak na member ng LGBTQ. Minsan sa mga pamilya ay pinapalayas nila sa kanilang bahay kasi nga hindi nila tanggap kung ano yung pagkatao ng anak nila. Formal social assistance can also discriminate by not recognizing same-sex couples or parents. For example, LGBT people in the Philippines are often barred from higher education and limited to irregular and low-paying jobs. Dito talaga sa Pilipinas, ang LGBTQ people ay limited lang sa mga matataas na antas. Dahil pinagpabawalan nila ito na pakapasok sa kanilang eskwelahan. At saka minsan din sa pagtatrabaho naman ay minsan mababa din yung mga kanilang sweldo. Mababa din ang kanilang mga sweldo at minsan din ay may mga LGBT talaga na hindi qualify sa mga trabahong ina-apply nila or nire-reject sila kasi nga LGBTQ sila, dinidiscriminate sila. On the other hand, research shows that LGBT people who are able to contribute to the household are more accepted socially and within families. Recommended actions. Conduct research. So, this aim to gain a greater understanding of how LGBT persons face economic discrimination and private sector development projects to ensure that private sector development programs are adapted to LGBT people's financial requirements. Next is social assistance programs. This is to ensure that social assistance programs such as money transfer acknowledge LGBTQ people's needs and provide support to the poorest, especially through enhancing community feedback system. So, goal number 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. LGBT exclusion from healthcare is unfortunately not confined to sexual and reproductive health. LGBT people are poorly served across the sector. So, a lack of understanding among healthcare providers and inadequate treatments because of racism. LGBT people who face greater mental health care challenges often due to exclusion and stigma from family and wider society can find a lack of appropriate support. Example, research shows that in India, MSM are less likely to access critical health services such as HIV testing, treatment, and condoms due to discrimination by healthcare providers. In Lebanon, the mental health of MSM was found to be directly shaped by the experience of stigma in their family and in their schools, universities, and workplaces. Recommended actions. Make sure all healthcare services, whether general, mental, or sexual and reproductive, include LGBT people by putting LGBT-inclusive anti-discrimination policies in place, training healthcare providers, To be able to recognize and address the needs of LGBT individuals, create outreach health services. Because of racism or discrimination, LGBT person the LGBT will be unable to leave their house and not able to create services that cater to the needs of LGBT persons, including HIV and other STI prevention, treatment, care, and support for all LGBT people. Next is safe spaces and services that cater to the LGBT community's broader healthcare needs. And last is services for trans people to transition safely. Goal number 4. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality of education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. In schools and universities around the world, young people are bullied or excluded by teachers and peers because they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, or because they are unsure of their gender identity or sexual orientation. Some find it impossible to continue with their studies and leave prematurely, while others might suffer in silence and get poor results, in turn affecting their future prospects. We all know that all of this will have a long-term impact on their mental health and well-being, especially on their studies. So, recommended actions. However, when schools and universities promote human rights for all and profile positive LGBT role models, harmful social attitudes can be challenged before they become fixed. All young people are then able to learn in a safe and enabling environment and become equipped for the nature. Example, LGBT youth in Brazil who were out at school suffered the most severe forms of physical violence and social discrimination, and represented the highest number of students who reported suicidal thoughts. So, recommended actions. Provide guidance and training for teachers and counselors. So, about how to approach LGBT kids and learners who are it's all about how to approach LGBT kids and and learners who are unsure of their sexual orientation or gender identity in a considerate manner. Next is adopt a zero tolerance policy. Bullying that seems to be homophobic, biophobic, as well as transphobic. Next is ensure that all teaching curriculum are LGBT inclusive and that positive LGBT role models are prominently featured. Sexual and reproductive education covers the specific needs of LGBT students. To ensure that all sexuality teaching met the needs of LGBT pupils and those who are unsure about their sexual orientation or gender identity. And the last is promote a culture of non-discrimination and acceptance. To develop an anti-discrimination and accepting culture like sa school, sa universities, or sa our society sa mga malaking area na nagbibigay diin na ang mga karapatan ng LGBT ay karapatang pantao rin. Goal number 5. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Lesbian, bi, and trans women can experience multiple discrimination and violence due of their intertwining LGBT and gender identities. While women in general are taken less seriously than men when reporting crimes to the authorities, they will be taken even less seriously if they identify as a lesbian or bisexual. Instead of helping, development programs can reinforce the inequalities that LGBT women face. Instead of helping, development programs can reinforce the inequalities that LGBT women face. In addition, these programs often work with a narrow definition of gender that is not trans-inclusive. On the other hand, aims for the abolition of all forms of prejudice and violence against women and girls, including lesbophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. At the same time, much more needs to be done to tackle harmful gender stereotypes that limit all people from being themselves and pursuing their goals. Gender-based violence is often driven by a desire. Persons who do not perpetuate gender norms are punished, and as a result, masculine and non-binary persons who deviate from these roles are punished as well. For example, in 2014, ActionAid surveyed women and girls in 9 townships in South Africa who were mostly lesbian or bi. Only 12% felt safe from verbal and physical abuse in their neighborhoods, and 27% said they never felt safe. Example, in 2014, ActionAid surveyed women and girls in 9 townships in South Africa who were mostly lesbian or bi. Only 12% felt safe from verbal and physical abuse in their neighborhoods, and 27% said they never felt safe. Recommended actions. Make sure that all programs working on gender equality and violence against women and girls address the particular issues faced by lesbian, bi, and trans women. Make sure that funding grants prioritize organizations led by LGBT women. Expand the definition of gender used in policies and programs to become fully trans-inclusive. Create programs that challenge harmful gender norms more widely. By explaining the impact of such rules on men and non-binary persons as well as the general public. Goal number 10. Reduce inequality within and among countries. Discrimination against LGBT people is frequently perpetuated by rules, regulations, and practices that either neglect or intentionally reject LGBT people. These laws, policies, and practices reinforce negative social attitudes and encourage backlash against the LGBT communities calling for equality. Globally, the list of discriminatory laws and policies is vast. It includes requiring trans people to undergo forced sterilization, failing to provide opportunities for trans people, refusing to give trans persons the chance to transform their gender status, making same-sex relations illegal, forbidding LGBT groups preventing LGBT organizations from forming non-governmental organizations and actively advocating for their rights. Next is excluding same-sex couples and trans people. Denying access to public assistance to same-sex couples and transgender people. Example: sex with someone of the same sex is illegal in 75 countries and punishable by death in 10. Just 55 countries recognize trans people's rights to change their name and gender on official documents. Recommended actions. Fund LGBT groups working. Donate to LGBT organizations who are striving to remove laws that discriminate policies and behavior. Support campaigns led by LGBT groups. Understands that the praise others' status. To ensure everybody in your organization understands and applies Goal 10.2's wording, other status, which covers LGBT people. Development partners do not discriminate. To ensure that your development partners, whether it is public, commercial, or non-profit, do not prejudice. Goal number 11. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. The high rate of LGBT homelessness is directly linked to discrimination. Many LGBT people are forced to leave home as a result of being bullied by peers and also being abandoned or mistreated by relatives. LGBT people, particularly young people and the elderly, are more vulnerable to physical violence, sexual abuse, and physical and mental health problems. They are unable to receive assistance, leading to a shortage of adequate support services and providers' lack of awareness of their demands. Wait, mukhang kulang. Okay, kulang talaga yung nakuha kong example sa scene. So, for example, here is studies from Italy, Turkey, and Uganda uncovered high rates of LGBTI homelessness. They discovered that assumptions of heterosexuality made by housing providers contributed to young LGBTI people being turned away from accessing housing services. Next. Recommended actions. Support and train local government and housing associations to promote and teach local governments and residential organizations to consider LGBT young people's unique needs. Provide specialist services. Safe zones safe zones for LGBT individuals at risk of hardship. Particularly young people and the seniors are the examples. Provide LGBT persons with affordable and non-discrimination residence choices. Last is take account of the needs of LGBT communities for safe housing. So, goal number 16 and the last goal. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. Provide access to justice for all and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So, any form of violent attack against anyone is unacceptable. The police and security agencies that are supposed to guard LGBT people actually target and abuse them, especially in areas where homophobic legislation exists. So, unfortunately, in many places, LGBT persons confront the obstacle of police and security agencies refusing to believe their accusations of abuse. So, hindi sila pinaniniwalaan ng kahit na sino mang alagad ng gobyerno, like sa police and sa like yung mga securities agents, because they are LGBT. They discriminate LGBT people lang dahil sa kanilang kasarian, where LGBT people cannot rely on the state's protections. Homophobic, transphobic, and biophobic attitudes in the media and legal system, along with laws that prevent civil society groups from speaking out. So, because they are afraid of being imprisoned if they submit acts of assault or violent treats. And it means that LGBT persons are extremely exposed to serious violation of human rights. However, when police and security services are trained in how to deal sensitively with LGBT hate crime, it can then be possible for them to provide the proper support. Like, for example, 1/3 of trans people in the EU have experienced violence or were threatened with violence in the last 5 years. About 2/5 of trans people who were victims of violence in the last 12 months said they had been violently attacked 3 times or more in the same year. So the recommended actions here are: make sure that all programs working on policing the criminal justice system or civil society actively address LGBT hate crime. Provide training on sensitivity and effective response to LGBT prejudice and racist attack for authorities, security agencies, and the criminal justice system, or assist those who are already giving any type of training. Build the capacity, and the last is build the capacity of police and LGBT groups. So, to improve the ability of cops or the LGBT organizations to report hate crimes toward them. So, this is my end of my presentation. So, I leave you a quote that there's nothing wrong with you. There's a lot wrong with the world you live in by Chris Colfer. That's all, and thank you.